Welcome to the inaugural lecture of our 2019-2021 Center for Historical Research program, Democracy in a Time of Change and Challenges. My name is Scott Levi. I'm chair of the History Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. This marks the sixth two-year program that the CHR has run since the Department of History began programming in 2007. Over the past 12 years, the Center for Historical Research has brought 126 presenters to Ohio State. I realize my number is now out of date. 127 presenters to Ohio State from academic institutions across the world. Our programs are historical by nature, but they embrace interdisciplinarity and appeal to colleagues across the arts and sciences and beyond. Previous CHR programs have focused on issues of early modern globalization, gender and migration, health and disease, the history of family and households, state formations, and comparative political revolutions. Since 2007, our speakers have addressed more than 3,500 people directly, and they have reached far more than 30,000 people through our online format. The CHR is at the heart of the History Department's research mission. Before the current CHR program director, Dr. David Stebenne, introduces our distinguished speaker today, I'd like to offer the podium to another distinguished guest. This may be the first opportunity that some of us have had to meet Gretchen Ritter, our newly appointed Executive Dean and Vice Provost of the College of Arts and Sciences. Gretchen Ritter comes to Ohio State from Cornell University, where she served 5 years as Dean of their considerably smaller College of Arts and Sciences. Prior to Cornell, Dean Ritter served as Vice Provost and Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. Dean Ritter's presence here is fortuitous in a number of ways. Not the least of these is that if she weren't busy leading the largest college of arts and sciences in the country, she could easily be one of the scholars that constitute our current program on democracy in a time of change and challenges. In addition to being a highly accomplished administrator, Dean Ritter is also a leading specialist in the history of women's constitutional rights and contemporary issues concerning democracy and citizenship in American politics. So please join me in welcoming our new Executive Dean, Gretchen Ritter.
So when I got the invitation to come here, I said, boy, wouldn't that be fun. As you just heard, it's a treat for me to be able to come to a university with so many distinguished scholars who are working on issues of democracy from across several departments, including history, including political science, including philosophy, among other things. And I'm so pleased to see this current series, and I'm grateful to the History Department, to the Center for Historical Research, for the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, among others, for pulling this together. This is a particularly important thing for an institution of higher education to do. One of the reasons I've devoted my career to higher education is because I believe that higher education plays a critical role in fostering democracy. I believe that it does this by creating opportunity and inclusion. I think that it does this by preparing people to be engaged citizens. And I also think that we do it through our research that allows citizens to hold the government accountable, and research that paves the way for improvement and a sense of a common future. But as we all know, we are in a moment now where not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world, we are not sure in democratic societies how strong the belief in a common future is, and whether our structures of democratic accountability are working as well as they should, and whether respect for constitutional norms run as deeply as they once did. So I think it's particularly an opportune moment for us to begin to learn from scholars who think about the other parts of the world as well, about these common challenges and what we might do together to create conversations that would bring us into a direction where we begin to restore a faith and a common future and democratic well-being. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce the program director for our CHR current program on Democracies, Dr. David Stebenne.
Thank you. I want to say at the outset that despite the somewhat discouraging title, choosing Friday the 13th for the meeting is entirely coincidental, and Professor Levitsky assures me that he'll be more cheerful than the title suggests, so that's good. And I don't really have much to say because I want to yield my time, the balance of it, to our guests, but I want to say thank you to a few people who have helped. First, of course, to Dean Ritter for taking time to come and speak, and to John Brooke. John, where are you? Raise your hand. The head of CHR. John's been the head of CHR seemingly forever. This generates an endless amount of work for him, and he was very helpful to me in doing all the things associated with putting this series together, so thank you, John. Also, to Mike Meltdown in the Political Science Department and the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability. The acronym is IDEA. Mike is out of town today, otherwise he'd be here. And this is a series that IDEA is helping with, has helped fund and is very interested in, and I want to acknowledge that. I also have all sorts of people from the History Department and elsewhere who have made me look good. Shannon Niemeyer, who oversees the room and the tech stuff, has been helpful on short notice. Colleagues, Paula Baker, Theodora Dragostikova, Jennifer Eaglin, Jane Hathaway, David Hoffman, Rob Judd, Usman Kobo, Chris Reed, Mike Thelis Ravinas, and Ying Zhang have all worked on this series. In other words, it's a global series. It surveys democracy around the world. No one would be omnicompetent enough to know the right speaker to pick for all of these different places, so it's been a team effort. My thought was if it's a series on democracy, it ought to be democratically organized and run, and it has been. So the point I'm trying to make here is thank you to them, and they're the ones who make me look good today. And having said that, let me move on to say a few words about our speaker. I had to look hard and fast, but I did find that his exact job title is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies in the Government Department at Harvard University. He's also the chair of the Research Cluster on Challenges to Democracy at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. And so Professor Levitsky is interested in democracy, especially political parties, authoritarianism, democratization, and weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. But his talk today is very much a sort of global one, which took a little bit outside of his usual form of address on this subject, but I thought he would be certainly up to it. And the one other thing I want to say before I yield the podium to him is just to let you know that my thought was that as we move from his overview today to the first session that deals with a specific nation and place in the world, that it would make sense to start with India, because it's generally regarded as the world's largest democracy. And so on October 4 at 3:30 to 5, Friday, October the 4th, in 168 Dulles, the next session will meet, and that will be the current state of democracy in India, which is a challenging subject and should be a very interesting one. And the speaker is Rohit Day from the History Department at Yale. So, of course, you're all welcome to come to that. All right, so having said that, Professor Levitsky, the floor is yours. Your extensive collection of PowerPoint slides are at the ready, and here you are.
Okay, thanks. I don't know how to do this. So my worst nightmare was not being able to see over the Ohio State Library sign. Barely did. Okay. So first of all, many thanks to the CHR, David and John, and to Dean Ritter for inviting me. I think democracy in a time of change and challenges really could not be a more timely series. And looking over the speakers that you've got lined up for this year, I wish I could come back more frequently. It's a great list of speakers. So if today is a dud, you can be assured that things will get better. Okay, so there is a consensus today in the West that democracy is under threat. Democratic backsliding seems to be rampant everywhere from Venezuela to Turkey to Hungary to India, which you'll hear about in a couple of weeks. And suddenly, unexpectedly, some of the world's oldest democracies have fallen into crisis. In this lecture, I want to try to give a more mixed picture. I'm going to argue, first of all, that claims of democratic retreat are overstated. Global democracy is not dying, at least not yet. But I'm also going to argue that established democracies in the West face a new challenge, that political establishments are weakening, and that has opened the door to populist forces that may threaten liberal democratic institutions. So paradoxically, I'm going to argue that illiberal populist forces are on the rise in the West because our politics are becoming more rather than less democratic. I'll get back to that. But let's start with this idea of a global democratic recession. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay. To understand the really quite gloomy perceptions that predominate today, we've got to go back to the 1990s. And I'm looking out and seeing these a bunch of undergraduates. First of all, thank you for coming in. And sorry, I realize you don't remember the 1990s, but I do. The 1990s, for those who don't remember, were a unique, really a unique period in world history. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the liberal West, Europe and the United States, became the world's overwhelmingly dominant military, economic, and ideological power. For about 15 years, the liberal West was hegemonic. And liberal democracy, Western-style democracy, became really the only game in town. During this period of Western liberal hegemony, global democratization reached unprecedented levels. Between 1975 and 2000, the number of democracies in the world nearly tripled. Democracy swept across Eastern Europe, swept across Latin America, into Asia, Africa, and the former Soviet Union. In fact, democratization occurred in places that from a social science standpoint, from a political science standpoint, were totally unexpected. So over the years, over half a century, some pretty smart social scientists have identified a set of conditions, though not necessary for democracy, dramatically increase the likelihood that democracy will emerge and survive. What are these conditions? Economic development, a big middle class, a robust private sector and civil society, a minimum of social equality, a functioning state. But in the post-Cold War era, the 1990s and early 2000s, democracy emerged in countries, in dozens of countries, with none of these conditions. Countries like Albania, Mongolia, El Salvador, Honduras, Benin, Mali. Now that's not necessarily because the existing theories were wrong. It's because the international environment was so favorable to democracy in the 1990s that things like wealth, class structure, the strength of civil society, the effect of those things was blunted. Because Western powers were so dominant during this period, because Western powers broadly encouraged the adoption of democratic institutions, the cost of outright dictatorship skyrocketed throughout much of the global periphery. Because things like coups and stolen elections risked international isolation in the 1990s, the number of coups and the number of stolen elections plummeted in the post-Cold War era. Now, the end of the Cold War, this post-Cold War era, triggered a surge of optimism about democracy's future, particularly here in the United States. So Francis Fukuyama famously suggested in his book, The End of History, that the alternatives to liberal democracy had been exhausted. My old professor, Larry Diamond, who's one of the world's leading authorities on democracy, gave speeches in the late 1990s entitled, "Can the Whole World Become Democratic?" In media circles, in policy circles, the global spread of democracy was treated as nearly inevitable. For many people, it was just a matter of time before the remaining authoritarian holdouts, countries like China, Vietnam, Cuba, Iran, the Arab world, it's just a matter of time before these countries democratized. And then in the early 2000s, the winds began to shift. Most importantly, the global balance of power shifted. The rise of China, together with the resurgence of Russia as an aggressive anti-liberal power, altered the balance of geopolitical power, eroding that Western liberal hegemony. And at the same time, Western powers saw their power, their prestige, their self-confidence erode. So the days in which the United States and Europe were the world's dominant military, economic, ideological power are over. And as a result, liberal democracy has ceased to be the only game in town. Aspiring autocrats today no longer fear international isolation because they can turn to China, to Russia for support. But it's not just the rise of China and Russia. Illiberal forces are resurgent in the West as well. The illiberal right is ascendant across Europe. It it's won the presidency in the United States. And as a result of the rise of what's essentially illiberal right-wing forces, Western democracies have polarized and grown increasingly dysfunctional. As democratic norms erode, as democracies grow increasingly dysfunctional, Western-style democracies losing its luster. Today, few Democrats across the globe look to the United States as a model. Western powers have also ceased promoting democracy abroad. The Trump administration is easily the least pro-democratic administration in the United States since Nixon in the 1970s. Rather than promote democracy in places like Honduras, Philippines, Hungary, Poland, the United States government has embraced autocrats. Likewise, the European Union, which was so effective in promoting democracy in Southern Europe in the 1970s and in East Central Europe in the 1990s, is now doing relatively little to combat creeping authoritarianism in Hungary, Poland, Serbia, and elsewhere. So the international environment is much less favorable to democracy than it was in the 1990s. The West is no longer the democratic model that it used to be, and Western democratizing pressure has largely disappeared. That has expanded autocrats' room to maneuver. It is easier, it is considerably easier, I haven't tried it, but it's easier to be an autocrat today than it was 25 years ago. And in fact, in a few cases, we've seen the rise of autocrats in places that have been considered solidly democratic. Turkey, Hungary, maybe even India. In this darkening context, the optimism of the 1990s has given way to pessimism about the state of democracy. In his new book, Ill Winds, which I recommend you read, Larry Diamond writes that the world is, and I quote, plunged into democratic recession, and that we now face a worldwide authoritarian resurgence. A few years ago, Joshua Kurlansik wrote an article called The Great Democracy Meltdown, and he claimed that global freedom had plummeted. Another observer wrote recently that we might in fact be seeing the beginning of the end of democracy. This changing mood from incredibly optimistic to very pessimistic can be seen in the annual reports published by the NGO Freedom House. In 2009, a decade ago, Freedom House started to grow dark. It characterized the years 2007 and 2008 as years of democratic decline. In 2010, the following year, Freedom House warned in its annual report that democratic decline had accelerated. In 2011, it claimed that democracy was under duress across the world. Now, Freedom House had a brief period of optimism after the Arab Spring in 2011, but in 2013, a year later, Freedom House was back in its annual report declaring again that democracy was in retreat. Its 2014 report warned of a global authoritarian resurgence. Its 2015 report was entitled Return to the Iron Fist. Last year's report warned that global democracy faced its worst crisis in decades, and this year's report, entitled Democracy in Retreat, claimed that the world had suffered 13 consecutive years of democratic decline. This democratic recession thesis has become the new conventional wisdom in U.S. media and policy circles. And there's only one problem with this conventional wisdom. It's wrong. Or slightly more precisely, the claim that global democracy has been in retreat for a decade or more lacks much in the way of empirical foundation. The level of democracy in the world has remained broadly stable over the last decade, and it continues to be considerably higher than it was in the 1990s. Democracy is broken down in a few very prominent, very widely attended to cases, broken down in Venezuela, in Thailand, in Turkey, in Hungary. It's under serious threat in a handful of other countries, Philippines, India. But the vast majority of new democracies that emerged in the late 20th century have survived. They survive across Latin America, despite the incredibly poor performance of governments in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere. They survive across most of East Central Europe, despite the spread of right-wing populism. Let's look at the data. Let's start with Freedom House. Freedom House is the leading proponent in the United States of the democratic recession thesis. Freedom House has, again, spent the last decade warning us year after year after year about democratic rollback and authoritarian resurgence. But if you look at Freedom House's own numbers, it's not so clear. In 1995, Freedom House scored 76 countries in the world as free. A decade later, in 2005, it scored 89 countries in the world as free. Now, 2005 is often viewed as sort of the peak year of global democratization. That's when the democratic recession supposedly began. So after 13 years of democratic rollback and authoritarian resurgence, how many countries do you think Freedom House scored as free last year? 86. That's a decline of 3 relative to peak democratization, but still 10 more than the mid-1990s. According to Freedom House, the percentage of countries in the world that are free has fallen from 46% in 2005 to 45% today. Another leading democracy index, Polity 4, provides even less evidence of a democratic recession. According to Polity, the number of democracies in the world increased from 49 in 1990 to 67 in 2000 to 81 in 2006. Last year, Polity scored 82 countries as democratic. That is an increase of 1 relative to Freedom House's golden age. One more democracy index, the one that I actually find best, VDEM, finds that the number of democracies in the world increased from 54 in 1990 to 85 in 2000 to 98 in 2010. Last year, after nearly a decade of so-called democratic recession, the number of democracies, according to VDEM, stood at 99. That's the highest level ever recorded by VDEM. In other words, VDEM considered 2018 to be the most democratic year in the history of the world. I have one PowerPoint slide. That slide shows Freedom House, Polity, and VDEM scores from 1990 to the present. The pattern, I think, is pretty clear. There was a dramatic increase in the number of democracies between 1980 and the early 2000s. Since about 2005, the level of democracy in the world has been stable. It has basically been a flat line. So over the last decade or so, democracies have broken down in Venezuela, in Thailand, in Hungary, in Turkey, Mali, Nicaragua. There's been serious backsliding in the Philippines, Poland, Honduras, Bolivia, Serbia, Benin. But at the same time, significant democratic improvements have occurred in countries like Tunisia, Armenia, Georgia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Colombia, Liberia, Gambia. So the overall picture during the early 21st century, the last 15 years or so, is one broadly of net stability. And again, global levels of democracy, as you can see here, are higher than at any other moment in history. Now, even if we take Freedom House's numbers, which show a net decline of 3 democracies, that decline, I want to suggest, has to be understood in context, in at least 2 senses. First of all, the international environment is, again, much less favorable to democracy today than it was 25 years ago. Given that, a net decline from 89 democracies to 86 democracies is not terribly bad. Second, more importantly, remember that the third wave produced an unprecedented number of democratizations, including in countries, in a bunch of countries, that possess none of the conditions that social scientists associate with stable democracy. Countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Albania, Mongolia, Benin. In other words, if we take seriously the lessons generated by 50 years of social science research, global democracy dramatically overperformed in the 1990s. There were many more democracies in the world than our theories suggested there should have been. Again, this was largely due in the 90s to a uniquely favorable international environment. Today, that environment has grown less favorable, which means that the democratic overperformers of the 1990s should be pretty vulnerable to breakdown. And in fact, a lot of the backsliding in the last decade has occurred in precisely those countries, in Mali, Benin, and Honduras, and Nicaragua. But as political scientist Dan Treisman shows, even with this modest backsliding, global democracy is still overperforming today. In other words, there are still many more democracies in the world than social scientists say there should be. Now, if claims of democratic backsliding are overblown, why then is there such a widespread perception of democratic recession? Why do really smart people, like my old professor Larry Diamond, think there's a democratic recession? I want to suggest, I think that it's a collective misunderstanding of post-Cold War transitions. One reason why the global landscape looks so dark today is that many observers viewed the developments of the post-Cold War period, essentially the 1990s, through rose-colored glasses. During the 1990s, observers fell into an excessively optimistic mindset in which it was more or less taken for granted that the whole world was on the road to democracy. That excessive optimism, that belief, that assumption that we're all headed to democracy led us to essentially conflate authoritarian crises with democratic transitions. We essentially conflate crises of authoritarian regimes with transitions to democracy. So whenever a dictatorship fell, we viewed it as democratization. And we labeled the new regime, no matter who was in power, almost no matter what they did initially, we labeled it a new democracy, an emerging democracy. And whenever an authoritarian regime took any kind of liberalizing step, including holding grossly unfair elections, we viewed it as the onset, the first stage of a democratic transition. This tendency to view all authoritarian crises as democratic transitions led observers, I think, to seriously misunderstand and mischaracterize many of the regime transitions or crises of the 1990s, especially in Africa and the former Soviet Union. Especially in Africa and the former Soviet Union. Again, 1990s, for those who were not alive, were widely viewed as a decade of unprecedented democratization. But it is a lot more accurate to call it a period or a decade of unprecedented authoritarian crisis. The end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, posed an unprecedented challenge to autocrats all over the world. Both Soviet client states, states that had been propped up by the Soviet Union, and Western-backed anti-communist regimes lost external support. The United States and the European Union, as I mentioned, began to promote democracy in the 1990s to an unprecedented degree, often cutting off aid to governments that refused to hold multi-party elections. So suddenly, overnight, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a whole bunch of states are under intense external pressure to democratize. At the same time, many autocracies in the early 1990s faced severe economic crises. Governments throughout Africa, and especially the former Soviet Union, literally ran out of money, which made it exceedingly difficult for them to sustain themselves in power. Dozens of states, again, especially in Africa and the former Soviet Union, literally went bankrupt. Governments did not have the money to pay soldiers, didn't have the money to pay the police, didn't have money to pay bureaucrats. The result was a weakening and even collapse of many states. I'm not talking about one or two countries. I'm talking in the 1990s about Albania, Cambodia, Haiti, Liberia, Benin, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Sudan, Chad, Niger, Rwanda, Burundi, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Mali, Malawi, Madagascar, Mozambique, Angola, Zaire, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Nepal. There are others. In literally dozens of countries, in the early and mid-1990s, states began to fall apart. State collapse pretty much guarantees you a regime crisis. It is hard to govern. It's hard to maintain yourself in power when police, soldiers, and bureaucrats are not getting paid. So conditions in the early 1990s constituted a virtual perfect storm for autocrats, for dictatorships, especially across Africa and the former Soviet Union. autocrats faced severe fiscal crisis. They ran out of money. They faced collapsing states. They couldn't pay their bureaucrats and soldiers. And they faced intense international pressure for multi-party elections. Without money, without external allies, without a reliable army behind them, dozens of autocrats fell into crisis. The result was what my co-author, Lucan Wei, calls pluralism by default. It's a situation where you get increased openness, you get competition, you even get turnover in power because the government lacks even rudimentary means to suppress opposition. Again, police who have not been paid are not likely to obey orders to fire on crowds of protesters. Pluralism by default was widespread in the early mid-1990s in countries like Albania, Angola, Cambodia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Benin, Congo, Gabon, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Zambia. Autocrats either fell from power or held elections, not because they faced strong democracy movements, not because a strong civil society was demanding democratic change, but because they were bankrupt, because their states were coming apart at the seams, and in many cases because they had lost control of the security forces. The problem, the analytical problem from our standpoint, is that observers often took these moments of state crisis, these moments of severe authoritarian crisis, they mistook them for moments of democratization. That is a very misguided characterization. Most of these authoritarian crises do not in any way constitute meaningful movement toward democracy. Again, autocrats in Azerbaijan, in Georgia, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, Tajikistan, Cambodia, Haiti, Mali, they fell from power because the state collapsed or because the state weakened to the point of dysfunctionality. State failure brings chaos. State failure brings instability. State failure very often brings violence and civil war. It almost never brings democratization. Even when the state didn't collapse, many of the regime openings of the 1990s were in reality moments of extraordinary authoritarian weakness. They were driven not by societal pressure for democracy, but instead by fiscal crisis, state incapacity, and intense external pressure. My point here is that many of the crises in Africa and the former Soviet Union in the 1990s were not democratizing moments. They were moments of extreme weakness and instability. Governments were bankrupt and weak, state institutions were weak, political parties were weak, civil societies were weak. Not only was this not democratization, but these were not conditions under which we would ever expect democratization. These were conditions that overwhelmingly favored either instability or further authoritarianism. Now, the perfect storm of the 1990s eventually passed. Economies improved over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s, and thanks to soaring commodity prices, many economies boomed in the first decade of the 21st century. As a result, governments that had been bankrupt in the early 1990s were now, in many cases, flush with resources. So now, in the 2000s, autocrats had the money to maintain their patronage networks, to pay their soldiers, to pay their bureaucrats, which made it a heck of a lot easier to hang on to power. The geopolitical environment also changed in important ways. Western democracies, again, lost power and prestige, while China, Russia, and other democracies gained influence. So thanks to much better finances and a much less hostile international environment, autocracies that had been really weak and really unstable in the early 1990s were able to stabilize and in some cases reconsolidate in the early 21st century. You saw this in Russia, you saw it in Belarus, in Azerbaijan, in much of Central Asia, you saw it in Cambodia, Cameroon, Gabon, Angola, Republic of Congo, Algeria, Mozambique, and elsewhere. This was a process unambiguously of authoritarian reconsolidation. But for those who had sort of optimistically viewed the pluralism by default of the early 90s as democracy, this looked like democratic breakdown. So one source of contemporary pessimism is that we interpreted many post-Cold War transitions through rose-colored glasses. And in fact, we looked out at cases of state collapse and we mislabeled them democratic transitions. When democracy failed to emerge, we grew pessimistic and we started talking about democratic recession. But democracy cannot retreat from places where it never existed in the first place. And democracy never even remotely existed in countries like Cambodia, Cameroon, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Ethiopia, Angola, Gabon, Burundi, and elsewhere. Now, if we focus our attention on the actual democracies that emerged during the third wave, democracies in Southern Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, East Asian states like Taiwan and South Korea, African states like South Africa and Ghana, if we look at really existing democracies, their performance over the last 2 decades is pretty good. Notwithstanding an increasingly unfavorable international environment, the number of democracies has remained stable. So one could argue that this is evidence not so much of democratic recession, but of a striking level of democratic resilience. How do we explain this resilience? I want to quickly point to 3 factors. First of all, the liberal West may be down, but it's not out. The United States and Europe remain powerful military, economic, and ideological players, and in many parts of the world, they remain more attractive partners than Russia and China. So Western influence has weakened, but it hasn't disappeared. Secondly, no broadly legitimate alternative model has emerged to challenge Western-style democracy. Unlike the 1920s and 30s, when fascism and communism emerged as legitimate, serious, legitimate alternatives to liberal democracy, today's alternative models have very little ideological appeal, and they have not been terribly successful. There is no Russian model that activists in Latin America and Africa are trying to replicate. Hugo Chavez's efforts to create a Bolivarian model in Venezuela failed miserably. Nobody in Latin America wants to be like Venezuela anymore. Now, some autocrats would like to replicate the Chinese model, but that turns out to be really hard to do. And even the Chinese model has relatively little mass appeal. You do not see people taking to the streets to demand single-party rule. So though liberal democracy may not be the only game in town, it's arguably still the best game in town and still the most popular game in town. Citizens across the world, or at least much of the world, remain broadly Churchillian. They do not love democracy, but outside of maybe Singapore, maybe China, they don't find the alternatives any better. Societies may not be deeply committed to the principles of liberal or Madisonian democracy, but people almost everywhere do tend to like competitive elections. And in particular, they like being able to use elections to get rid of bad governments. No other regime type in the world gives citizens that option. And that's why we still see people in the streets pushing back against autocrats in Armenia, in Algeria, in Hong Kong, in Poland, in Turkey, Venezuela, Nicaragua, even in Sudan. Now, people in the streets do not always win, but even in today's international environment, they make it a lot harder for governments in much of the world to just do away with democratic institutions, to do away with competitive elections. That brings me to my third point. Many of the world's new authoritarian regimes are fragile. In fact, many of them are just as fragile as democracies are. Autocratic governments face the same problems that democracies do. They face problems of corruption, rising crime rates, poor public services, widespread unemployment. And when they fail to deliver goods, autocratic governments have to confront widespread public discontent. So during the last 10 years alone, the last decade alone, established autocrats were overthrown in Algeria, in Armenia, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Gambia, Malaysia, Sudan, Tunisia, and Yemen. And new autocrats failed to consolidate power and fell in Ecuador, in Mali, Ukraine, in Georgia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. In Nicaragua and Venezuela, once powerful autocrats lost almost all legitimacy and are hanging on to power by a thread. Even in Turkey, opposition is mounting amid rising public discontent. So many of the world's emerging autocracies that get their picture on magazines in articles about the new era of strongman rule, many of them are not very robust. Many of them, in fact, remain weak, unstable, and vulnerable to collapse. So rather than a global pattern of democratic recession or a global pattern of authoritarian resurgence, I see a much more mixed picture, with one that has darkening horizons to be sure, but also one that shows a surprising amount of democratic resilience. Now I want to shift direction a little bit in the remainder of my talk, and I want to talk about a challenge facing established democracies in the West, and that is the rise of liberal and populist forces, some of which have begun to attack the norms and even the rules of liberal democracy. This is Trump, Salvini, Le Pen, Austrian Freedom Party, Brexit Party, there are others. The rise of populism has gotten a lot of attention, but nearly all of this attention has focused on the demand side of populism, why voters are turning to populism. So many scholars focus, correctly, on economic issues. They highlight the failure of established parties to protect unskilled workers from the effects of globalization, disappearing jobs, stagnating incomes, and rising inequality, especially in the wake of the 2008-2009 economic crisis, or financial crisis. Other scholars correctly point to the role of race and culture, and how Americans and Europeans are responding to immigration and ethnic diversification. Dan Ziblatt and I make an argument along these lines in How Democracies Die. We argue that it's the reaction of previously dominant white Christian majorities to the reality of growing diversity and racial equality that drives polarization and norm erosion in the United States. Those demand-side factors, whether economic or cultural, are clearly important. But there's also a very important supply side to this story. It is much easier to be a populist today than ever before. It's certainly a lot easier to be a populist today than it was, say, in the era of Huey Long, because political establishments are weakening across the globe. Now, what the hell do I mean by political establishment? I'm not sure. For now, I'm going to define it as the collection of organizations and actors that control the resources politicians need to get elected and to sustain a career. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus on three types of establishment organization. One is established political parties. Parties are important to politicians because they control access to candidacy. Right? Pretty simple. You can't get higher office if you don't get nominated. Second actor is business, labor, and other interest groups. They are a critical source of finance and other campaign resources, activists. And the third actor is interest groups, parties. The third one is major media outlets, television stations, newspapers. Those are the principal means, at least until recently, through which politicians gain access to voters. Now, I'm not Noam Chomsky, if you didn't know. I'm not arguing that political parties, interest groups, and media outlets constitute a single monolithic block. There is considerable amount of pluralism and competition among them. But they do impose certain boundaries, both in terms of political style and policy substance. And politicians who exceed those boundaries, who violate certain behavioral norms, who push certain extremist policies, they tend to be shunned by the establishment. Party leaders won't nominate them, union leaders won't back them, mainstream media won't cover them, or they'll be biased against them. Now, half a century ago, that mattered a lot because political establishments enjoyed a monopoly over the resources that politicians needed to get elected. You go back to the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s in many countries, even the 80s in many countries, party leaders, political party leaders, controlled the candidate selection process. There were no primaries. Go back 40 or 50 years, and a relatively small number of interest groups provided the vast bulk of finance and other campaign resources to parties. Big labor, big business. And there were a limited number of media outlets that dominated the media scene. The United States had 3 major television networks. Britain had 2. That meant, going back 40 or 50 years, that any politician who was serious about getting elected had to maintain good relations with the establishment, had to be on reasonably good terms with the establishment. Politicians needed the approval of an established political party if they wanted to run for office. They needed the approval of major interest groups so they could raise money. And they needed the approval of major media outlets so they could get decent coverage. That dependence of politicians on the establishment had pretty important consequences. It meant that politicians could not just respond to voters, couldn't just respond to voter preferences, they also had to respond to the establishment. They had to strike a balance between appealing to voters and appeasing the establishment. For better or worse, that had a powerful moderating effect. It basically meant that only insiders, only broadly pro-establishment politicians could sustain a successful political career. That arrangement was not terribly democratic, but it was pretty functional and pretty stable. And that was, in effect, 20th century Western democracy. It was a system in which political competition was real, but it was nevertheless constrained by politicians' dependence on the establishment. Politicians who challenged the establishment, people we call populists, usually failed. That establishment monopoly existed in democracies all over the world in the 20th century. The United States, UK, France, Germany, Canada, you name it. But not anymore. Over the last few decades, accelerating I think in the last couple of decades, establishments have been losing their monopoly over electoral resources, which means they're losing their power over politicians. In the United States and the UK, established parties have lost their monopoly over candidacies, thanks to intra-party democratization. In the United States, primaries have empowered voters, undermining the gatekeeping authority of party leaders. In the UK, gatekeeping power now lies in the hands of party activists, not party leaders. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can raise money on the internet. Bernie freaking Sanders raised as much money as Hillary Clinton in 2016. Unthinkable 40 years ago. And of course, the emergence of social media has eroded the influence of established media. Today, Twitter, Facebook, other social media that I've never heard of, but my daughter have allowed candidates to reach voters even if they're shunned by the mainstream media. I went to Sao Paulo last year, just a few months before Brazil's presidential election, and met with a whole bunch of business leaders. And almost all of them backed the established center-right candidate, a guy named Geraldo Alckmin. Alckmin was a quintessential establishment candidate. He was the Jeb Bush and the Hillary Clinton of Brazil. Now, even though Alckmin was down in the polls, he was third or fourth in the polls when I went, Sao Paulo's business elite, very educated, very smart, very sophisticated folks, were convinced that Alckmin would eventually win the election because he was backed by a slew of mainstream political parties, and because of that, following Brazil's election law, that gave him a huge advantage in allocated television time. So Alckmin would get more than an hour a night of free TV time, whereas right-wing populist candidates, Jair Bolsonaro, only got 6 or 7 seconds a night. So every night he could say hi, and then we come. Nobody I talked to in Sao Paulo 3 months before the election mentioned WhatsApp or YouTube. But Bolsonaro used those social media to bypass the TV networks, to bypass those television stations where Alckmin was speaking, and to win the election. Politicians today do not need the establishment the way they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. They can raise money online, they can reach voters via Twitter and Facebook, they can hijack political parties through primaries like Trump did, or they can create their own parties like the Five Star Movement in Italy. For politicians, this is incredibly liberating. Freed of their dependence on the establishment, politicians now can respond directly to voters, they can respond freely to voter concerns without worrying very much about what the elite thinks. In fact, they can campaign against the elite. They can adopt an all-out populist strategy and promise voters to bury the elite. In the wake of financial crisis and a context of rising inequality and heightened racial and cultural resentment, there's a fair amount of public demand for just those kind of populist appeals. But there's always been a demand for populism among Western electorates. Millions of Americans backed Father Coughlin, backed Henry Ford, backed Huey Long, backed George Wallace. What's new is what's happening on the supply side. It is now much easier to operate outside the establishment. It is now much easier to oppose the establishment than it was 50 or 100 years ago. This new scenario, in which all democracies are headed, is much more democratic than the old one. Thanks to their newfound independence from the establishment, politicians, again, can be much more responsive to voters. They can give the voters what they want. But that leaves us more vulnerable than before to populist demagogues, many of whom go on to assault liberal democratic institutions. This is a hell of a paradox. More democracy is posing a threat to our democratic institutions. Remember, Western elites used to hate democracy. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, Western elites, including our founders, were terrified of democracy because they equated democracy with majority rule or rule by the masses. Western elites did not really accept democracy until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That is when the economic elites came to terms with what we call modern democracy. What made democracy acceptable to the elite, in part, was counter-majoritarian institutions that constitute what we now call liberal or representative democracy. But the other thing, I think that's gotten insufficient attention, the other thing that made modern democracy safe for elites was the power of political establishments. 19th and 20th century establishments imposed powerful but mainly hidden constraints on democratic competition. They transformed what could have been highly plebiscitary, highly majoritarian competition into a much more bounded, elite-centered competition. So those establishments essentially created what we now think of, at least political scientists think of, as Schumpeterian democracy, a system of elite competition. 20th century democracy in the West was profoundly Schumpeterian, and Schumpeterian democracy depended profoundly on a strong political establishment. But the days of Schumpeterian democracy may be coming to an end. The establishment's gatekeeping powers have eroded considerably. That change, again, is profoundly democratizing. Parties and politicians are becoming, or at least able to be, much more responsive to voter demands. But at the same time, this change has opened the door to demagogues like Trump, Salvini, Duterte, Chavez, Bolsonaro. Many of whom, not all, but many of whom, have gone on to assault liberal democratic institutions. So the decline of political establishments brings greater democracy in a profound sense. But at the same time, it leaves our democratic institutions, it leaves democratic regimes more vulnerable than they used to be. How contemporary democracies will hold up in this new populist era, I think, is still anybody's guess. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for questions. And Ned, you want to ask the first question? Go ahead.
Sure. It's Ned Foley from the law school, and my question is rooted in sort of John Hart Ely's theory of judicial review, so that's a useful frame of reference. And what I mean by that is, definitionally, you talk both in terms of liberal democracy and democracy without liberalism as an adjective.
Yeah.
And I wonder to the extent that that's analytically really crucial in our ability to evaluate the degree to which populism is a threat to democracy versus liberal democracy. And one way to think about that is if, the difference between, say, John Hart Ely and William Brennan, for example, is John Hart Ely would make sure that the constitution of a society protected democratic voting rights procedures, but not any of the liberal rights to religious freedom, let's say, or reproductive freedom, those substantive rights that would be essential to a liberal theory of government, would be up for grabs. But Ely would make sure you protect the procedural rights of a fair election. So if a populist regime came to power but honored the procedural rights of democracy, even though it didn't honor the liberal rights, it wouldn't be liberal democracy, but it might be democracy, whereas the other fear is that populism will go all the way. It will use democratic procedures to capture power and then eliminate voting rights themselves, the way Hitler did in Nazi Germany. So has there been any analytical work, as we see the rise of populism in Hungary and Poland and so forth, to distinguish between the degree to which it's a threat to liberal democracy on the one hand versus any kind of democracy on the other?
That is a great question, and one that is subject of intense debate, I think, especially among Europeans and Central Europeans who are grappling with this issue in Hungary, because Orban hasn't locked anybody up. Hungary is one of the few countries that I think can make a case for being an illiberal democracy. Let me give you my cut at it. I don't think this debate is resolved. I try to be careful in distinguishing. The way that at least political scientists define modern democracy is liberal democracy. You cannot have a modern democracy without certain liberal rights. Now, I think there are some liberal rights that you mentioned that are widely considered liberal rights that are not essential to modern democracy. Maybe reproductive rights. Maybe I'm not sure about religious freedom. But there are certain liberal rights that are absolutely core to modern democracy. Press freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of protest. You cannot have a democracy without those I consider those liberal rights. So you can have a liberal, so if you reproductive rights are very important, set them aside for now. If you strip away those liberal political rights, the right to free speech, free association, freedom of protest, freedom of press, you cannot have any sort of democracy for long. You can represent a majority at T1, the first election, but in the second election there is no guarantee that you'll have a competitive election. And in fact, history shows us that the playing field almost invariably becomes skewed. So I continue to assert, and this is a contested view, but I continue to assert that you really cannot have a modern democratic regime without an important dose of political liberalism. Now, obviously democracy is defined in many ways, and I mean it obviously when I say that a system free of establishment influence is potentially much more democratic. If governments are more responsive to popular majorities, there's something fundamentally democratic about that. But I think it very quickly hurls itself against the principles of liberal democracy.
Dean Ritter.
So, in thinking about this in the context of the United States, one of the things that's striking to me is that it's not really clear that we're talking about a populist majority, right? In fact, I think in many ways what we're talking about is a privileged elite that is aligning with a resentful populist minority and not winning popular votes, but obtaining power. And so how one thinks about addressing that and providing a path forward might be a little different than imagining this as a populist majority.
Yeah, the U.S. is certainly distinct in that it's got a slew of counter-majoritarian institutions that other Western democracies don't have. And some of them, the Electoral College and the Senate, are becoming particularly problematic today because really for the first time in history, I think, I was, as a political scientist in a history before, anytime I say the word history, I shudder. But for the first time that I can remember, it has a real partisan bias, right? The Senate and the Electoral College were always biased against urban centers. They're always biased against heavily populated areas. But historically, the Democrats and Republicans both had both urban and rural wings. Only now, in the last couple of decades, we have a party of sparsely populated territories, the Republicans, and a party of metropolitan centers, the Democrats. So those counter-majoritarian institutions are actually working in favor of one party against another. That's particularly problematic. So that does set the U.S. up with a distinct set of problems. But I would make at least some distinction between the Republican Party and Trump. The Republican Party was a party heavily influenced by a very small number of billionaires that had dragged the party to the right in many, many ways. But that plutocratic element that was seizing control of the Republican Party over the period of a couple of decades was beaten by Trump. They didn't like Trump, they didn't want Trump, he was their last choice, and he beat them. But he beat them in the primaries. Donald Trump won the primaries against the establishment and against the elite. the primary process in particular was highly populist. Now, when he becomes a Republican nominee, the fact that the Republican Party leadership then abdicated its gatekeeping role and accepted him is another story. But Trump is not a natural byproduct of where the Republican Party was going in the 2000s. He beat the Koch brothers.
And actually, if I could follow up on the question, the other land to which the U.S. is most indebted for its basic political institutions is the UK, and it's different, but it has an unelected prime minister, and if the polls are correct, if his party polls 37%, he'll win a majority of the House of Commons. So they don't have an electoral college, but they also have these means of taking people who are, in some sense, at most plurality winners, and then they claim to be the voice of the majority of the people. So is this a hallmark in lots of places, or is this just a US-UK phenomenon?
Well, that's mostly a product of electoral rules. The United States and the UK have a plurality electoral system for the parliament, for the legislature, which allows first plurality, particularly intense first pluralities, to win.
Right.
So, and this has happened in Canada as well. It has a similar electoral system. But the advantage that right now, this moment, that Johnson-led Conservative Party has in elections is that it's a sort of cohesive 38 to 40% of the electorate, and the rest of the party system is very fragmented.
And that was my question building off of Dean Ritter's question. Is it more a situation where they aren't a majority in these contexts, but they face a very fragmented rest of the spectrum, and so they're just the largest piece, and that's what's giving them control?
It gives them a political advantage. It doesn't give them control. Populists very often, at least initially, represent intense preferences. They represent a group. I mean, it's not every day. Now, leave aside Britain. It's not every day. Populists essentially tell voters that they are going to take a wrecking ball to the elite. They're just going to pick up people like me, Harvard professors, and throw them in the freaking river. They're going to punch the elite in the gut. It is not every day that voters opt for that. It's voters usually who are pretty angry and pretty fearful. It's an intense plurality. So one advantage that Trump has in the 2012 election, he's never, now one day has he had a majority approval rating in the United States, but the 41-ish% of Americans who support him are going to get out and vote. Mostly because old white people vote more than young non-white people, so his coalition is more likely to vote. But it is an intense plurality, and that is what gives them the advantage. The one reason why the rest of the country, at least in Britain, and one could see this maybe happening in Canada, hasn't happened in the United States, but the rest of the country is fragmented. It's a very diverse group, right? The Make America Great folks are a pretty cohesive, searching for the word, pretty cohesive bunch. The rest of the country is incredibly fragmented, incredibly heterogeneous. I'm not sure it's a long-term source of power, but it's an electoral advantage.
Gotcha. Other questions? Yes. I'm drawing a blank. Yes, sir.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit more about what populism means? It seems to be that anybody's against the establishment is a populist. A populist can be either liberal or illiberal. If they're illiberal, it means they try to get rid of what you call the First Amendment rights, essentially. Is Elizabeth Warren a populist because she taxed millionaires, for example?
It's a good question. So nobody agrees on what populism means, and I actually think that has been really stretched as a concept, almost beyond recognition. I think personally that in media and much of scholarship, it's essentially being conflated with illiberalism. Anybody that liberals from the center left to the center right, from people like me to The Economist magazine, look at and don't like because they're illiberal, we call populist. That is the only thing that I can see unifying all the folks that get regularly described as populists in smart media today. I think it's best, I think ultimately for me, the way I use populism is essentially anti-elite. It is a politician who makes usually a personalistic, plebiscitarian appeal from above to the masses to bring down the entire elite. It is essentially an anti-elite discourse. I think it's not that, even though I did it, it's not terribly useful to label people as populist or not populist. Populism is a strategy. And there's some, I don't consider Elizabeth Warren terribly populist. In the US, we often conflate populism with liberal, left of center. She does talk about millionaires, she talks about tax. I think Sanders uses a little bit more of a populist discourse than Warren. I wouldn't call either of them populist. I'd say they occasionally use populist discourse.
Well, a large number of politicians have been against Washington. For example, Jimmy Carter. His whole thing was we're going to clean house, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, look.
Tricky concept.
Yes, it is more than a tricky concept. It's an awful concept. But look, everywhere where politics is, political parties, politicians are not popular anywhere. So anybody who wants to make a living in politics has to run against the Beltway. So a certain dose of really light populism running against the Beltway is essential. Right? Nobody has ever been, at least in my lifetime, pro-establishment in their campaign discourse. But I think that there's important and meaningful variation between the very soft populism of a Carter or a Clinton who did not propose to tear down the elite, who drew from the elite, who worked with the elite, and the populism of a Huey Long or a Perón or a Chavez, who really did bring down the elite.
Oh, that's a question. Yes.
So you mentioned that there's like elements that are causing like autocracies to be more to thrive more. So like for example, tell me if you think this would fall into this category where China recently has been offering to trade like bonds that are backed with gold for oil to get around the petrol dollar. Do you think that will have an effect in the future when it comes to like,
This is where?
like China's trading have like bonds that are backed with gold. They're trading them for oil with Russia right now. You think that'll have an effect on, and that expands to other countries, you think that'll have an effect on the democracy's ability to bully autocracies like they were in the 90s?
Yes, I think what it does, that's a great example. What it does is it gives existing or aspiring autocrats more room to maneuver. In the 1990s, if you wanted to lead, if you were a general who wanted to overthrow an elected president and establish a junta or cancel elections, you had relatively few options. You were very likely to face a painful level of international isolation, unless you had a lot of oil. And today, it's easier to do. There are more options. There are more trading options. There are more external aid options. There are more diplomatic support options for autocrats in peripheral states. That's a great example of how this doesn't necessarily bring down democracies, but it makes autocracy easier. It makes it more viable.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, that's.
My question is, do you think it's harder now for regimes to avoid facing any sort of democratic plebiscite or vote? I mean, the number of pure autocracies that face no elections, like Central Asia, Azerbaijan, some in Africa, seem to be smaller and smaller, and obviously China as well. But I wonder why do you think that number is shrinking, and can that pendulum ever bounce back, or once you pass a certain threshold, must a regime or a government face the electorate in some form, however flawed?
That's a good question. And the movement in the last few years is not so clear. So what you say is absolutely right of recent decades. The number of pure autocracies has fallen considerably. Basically, in order to pull it off, you've got to have a lot of oil or other minerals, you've got to have a huge market like China, or you've got to have nukes, or be so peripheral that nobody ever pays attention to you. Most peripheral states are unable to sustain pure dictatorship. And that's, that interesting phenomenon is what led me to write a book 10 years ago about hybrid regimes, about competitive authoritarian regimes that remained authoritarian but nevertheless were compelled to open up and allow some level of competition. Now there's a little bit of evidence in the last decade or so that that pure autocracy may be resurging, that there's slightly fewer competitive authoritarian regimes today than there were a decade ago, and it's just like it's easier to be an autocrat, it seems like it's at least somewhat easier in some parts of the world to be a fully closed regime. So, or to be right on that borderline. Like Cambodia was a competitive authoritarian regime for a couple of decades, it's now pretty closed. Russia was a competitive regime in the 90s and early 2000s, is now pretty closed. Belarus in the 90s was a competitive authoritarian regime, is now entirely closed. So I think it's too early to develop any kind of coherent explanations, but there's a little evidence that pure autocracy may be on the upswing.
Yeah, so your picture of the global situation made me feel a little better. Thanks for that. I'm sorry to ruin it by asking you to argue against yourself, but your point that was partly resting on over-optimism about what was going on in some of the transitions of the 90s seems like a pretty powerful one. When you tell that to Larry Diamond, will he be consoled that the net picture is still good, or does he have other reasons for thinking?
No, Larry and I fight about this all the time. Larry's counter-argument is twofold. One, which I basically agree with, which is, well, it hasn't happened yet, but it's about to happen. The other shoe is about to drop. There's reasons to think that we're about to take that plunge. You guys will hear about India in a few weeks. India has elected a government that is potentially could do a fair amount of damage to liberal democracy. It hasn't really yet. So Larry says that the quality of many democracies has slid, and a bunch of democracies have kind of slid right to the brink, and they're sort of eroding democratic norms, and so there's sort of, it's about to happen in effect. He also takes, I shouldn't say I don't think he takes more seriously than I do the process by which countries like the Central African Republic go from being like an 11 on Freedom House score, which is really bad, to a 14, which is ungodly bad. This is this process of sort of expected authoritarian reconsolidation when you can now pay the police. That I don't think about that as democratic backsliding, and Larry does. I guess he shared more of the optimism in the 90s and 90s.
Dick, go ahead.
To what extent is nativism rather than populism the core of the message that's disseminated by these demagogues? And I'm pushed in this direction. We're looking at mass-level data concerning support for democracy, and it parallels what you find, and that is that there is no worldwide trend, but on the other hand, there are some areas where there's a very significant decline in support for democracy that parallels developments at the elite level. And in particular, this involves Western Europe. The AfD in Germany, the National Front in France, Golden Dawn, the Lega. You just go across the board, and there's one theme that strikes me that fits very nicely with the timeline, and that is massive migration, beginning in particular with the Arab Spring, leading to a totally different kind of zeitgeist. I mean, one of the things that Brexit shares with the rest is this hostility towards these foreigners that are free to come across the border. To what extent is that element of timing related to this? It certainly would be at the same time as a shift to mass media would break down the monopoly of information flows to voters, but it strikes me as something that would trigger this kind of movement.
Absolutely. First of all, I think what you say in pointing to the fact that a number of these movements are nativist, to be more descriptive, I think that is another point of the critique against the misuse of populism. I think nativism is a better term than populism, probably for Golden Dawn, probably for National Front, certainly for the AfD in Germany. I think that's a case, and I'm guilty of this, of labeling because nativism is, I think, fair to say, essentially illiberal. It's another case of labeling an illiberal phenomenon populism. Maybe it's not popular. In some cases, there is a populist appeal because elites, whether it's the EU or the mainstream parties, are perceived as not protecting the nation against immigrants, as protecting or even privileging ethnic minorities over native or majorities. And so some politicians, including Trump, package nativism in a populist appeal. But I think you're right that a lot of this is better described as nativism than populism. I think also that it's an important part of the demand side story about what's going on. I don't disagree with that at all. It's not something that I'm researching, but it makes a lot of sense to me. My only point is to complement that demand side story with a supply side story. I think if you take that external shock, 40, 50 years ago, the establishment would have been in a better position to fend off nativist challengers than it is today. That nativist appeals are part of that demagogic appeal that is easier to do today than it was half a century ago.
Good questions. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So you touched on some of the ways that technology has been used to promote populism. I was curious if you had any experience with how technology could or has been used to promote liberal democracy or any other level.
Oof. This, I should say, this is way outside my area of expertise. I don't know much about it. Initially, when social media first hit the scene, scholars of democracy were really optimistic about it because it seemed to potentially serve really useful liberal democratic ends in the sense that it allowed citizens to inform themselves, to communicate, and to mobilize against autocracies in ways that they couldn't before. And that is true. What we didn't anticipate 10 years ago so much was some of the downsides, or the ability of regimes, particularly the Chinese regime, to respond and to counterattack. So beyond that, I'm pretty ignorant of the ends to which social media can be used for I'm not in the. There are a lot of people worry a lot about the effects of social media on politics, and not necessarily populism, but polarization. So there's pretty good evidence coming out, research showing that exposure to social media does in fact polarize us. And so that's a real cause for concern. It may be contributing to the growing dysfunctionality, for example, of U.S. democracy. I may be a little Pollyannish here, but we have gone through other periods of media and technological change, and we were terrified of radio when it hit. We were terrified of television when it hit, and both societies and politicians sort of learned how to adapt. So at least part of me is mildly confident that we will find ways to adapt and make positive use of social media.
Good questions. Yes. Go ahead.
At the beginning of this lecture, you mentioned that the West was the overwhelming hegemon for thinking
rise of China and Russia began to challenge Western ideology? To what extent was this the result of events within Russia and China? And then on the other hand, to what extent...
George, that was in I didn't hear the last part.
I'm asking to what extent was the phenomenon of like Russia and China rising and challenging Western hegemony? To what extent was this the result of events within Russia and China? And then on the other hand, to what extent was this the result of events within the West? For example, particularly in the United States, the gradual decline of interest in aggressively promoting democracy abroad.
Great question. I think it's both things. I think fundamentally it's China, the 90s were a special moment in that the Soviet Union, which was a major geopolitical rival, underwent an extraordinary collapse. It basically went out. The state went out of business for a decade and was pushed to the sideline. You have a bipolar world in which one pole utterly collapses, and you're going to get a special moment. That was inevitably going to end. China's growth has mostly endogenous causes that go back many decades, and that was coming. That was going to happen. And Russia's resurgence also, to some degree, was going to happen, and it was facilitated by soaring commodity prices in the early 21st century. So mostly, I would say, this is a product of things going on in China and Russia. But John Mearsheimer gave a talk that I attended a couple of weeks ago, in which he countered that thesis pretty strongly and said that U.S. behavior had a lot to do with the problems it now faces with China and Russia, and the aggressive expansion of NATO to the east, and efforts to promote democracy within Russia, and humiliation of Russia. There were a lot of things that the United States did with its democracy promotion, and he focused a lot on NATO expansion, that provoked the situation that now the U.S. faces. So the story in which the sort of innocent U.S. is being confronted with these bad guys abroad is probably a little more complicated than that.
Yes, ma'am.
So I guess I'm wondering, so you said earlier that a lot of these populists rely on it rises from the diversification of society, and as society becomes more diverse, it's one of the big factors you listed, I think. But also at the same time, it's like an anti-establishment type of thing. So I feel like generally these groups that are more diverse, like these minority groups, aren't part of the establishment. So I'm just a little bit confused on like how those two things are, like they just seem very opposite to me, and like that they aren't synonymous at all. But
Am I cutting you off?
no,
that's a great question. I think in part that gets back to the point that Professor Gunther made a minute ago, that a lot of what many of us, including me, label populism is more accurately described as nativism, and that explains more easily the attack on outgroups. I think there is a sense, though, in varying degrees in different countries, to which populists depict minorities as protected and privileged by the elite. So you're absolutely right. In almost every, I cannot think of a democracy in which ethnic and racial minorities are actually a strong part of the establishment. Rarely, they're usually much more common. They are quite marginal, but they are depicted as protected by the elite and privileged by the elite. You see some of that with Modi in India. You see it with Trump. Complaints about political correctness and affirmative action and immigration. So it is part of the of a populist nativist discourse to depict the establishment as an ally of the minorities you don't like.
And I think we're out of time. It's right around 5 o'clock. And so Professor Levitsky, I think, will loiter up here a bit. But I think we should call an end to the session, in part because it's 5 o'clock on a Friday. You may have other places to be. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for great questions. And thank you, Professor Levitsky.
Thank you.